On a freezing November night in rural Pennsylvania, the kind of night when the rain feels like needles against your skin and the wind cuts straight through bone, a 17-year-old boy named Caleb Harper pedaled his rusted bike along the shoulder of Route 17, just trying to make it home before his mother started worrying. He had finished a late shift stacking shelves at Miller's Hardware, earning barely enough to keep the lights on in their small two-bedroom house outside town. His sneakers were soaked, his backpack heavier than usual, and the only warm thing on him was the faded army green jacket his late father used to wear. That was when he saw the old man stumble near the guardrail, hesitate as if searching for something in the darkness, and then collapse face first into the rain-slick asphalt. Cars sped past. Headlights flashed. No one slowed down. No one stepped out. Caleb dropped his bike without thinking and ran toward the stranger, kneeling beside him as cold water pooled around them. The man's hands trembled violently, his breathing shallow and uneven, his gray hair plastered to his forehead. Caleb looked up at the passing traffic, hoping someone older, someone wealthier, someone more capable would take over. No one did. So he made a choice that would change more than his own life. He took off his father's jacket, the only real warmth he had, and wrapped it around the old man's shaking shoulders. He stayed there, shielding him from the rain with his own body, whispering, "Sir, you're going to be all right. I'm here." What Caleb didn't know, what no one on that dark stretch of highway could have guessed, was that this fragile, forgotten man lying in the rain was Thomas Whitmore, the estranged father of one of the most powerful real estate millionaires in the state of Pennsylvania. And that small act of kindness, offered without expectation and witnessed by almost no one, was about to expose a family secret worth millions. But this story isn't about money. It's about betrayal, legacy, and a son who forgot where he came from. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Caleb Harper grew up on the outskirts of a town that had once thrived on steel and railroads, the kind of American town where fathers worked with their hands and sons were expected to do the same. When the factories closed in the early 2000s, families like the Harpers were left scrambling. Caleb's father, a welder for nearly 20 years, lost his job during a wave of layoffs that followed the broader decline of American steel production documented across Pennsylvania and Ohio. According to historical labor reports and local news archives from that era, entire communities saw unemployment rates spike as plants shut their doors, and the Harpers were no exception. Bills piled up, arguments grew louder, and when Caleb was just 10 years old, his father died suddenly from a heart condition that had gone untreated because the family could no longer afford consistent medical coverage. From that day forward, Caleb's mother, Diane Harper, worked double shifts at a nursing home 30 miles away, leaving before sunrise and often returning long after dark. Caleb learned early what responsibility felt like. He cooked dinner for his younger sister Emma, helped her with homework, and fixed whatever broke around the house using tools his father had left behind. He wasn't a straight-A student, but he was steady. Teachers described him as quiet, dependable, the kind of boy who would stay after class to stack chairs without being asked. By 17, he had taken on part-time work at Miller's Hardware, earning minimum wage and saving what he could in a coffee tin hidden in his closet. His dream, though he rarely spoke of it, was to study civil engineering at Penn State, inspired by stories he had read about America's aging bridges and infrastructure problems highlighted in national reports from organizations like the American Society of Civil Engineers. He wanted to build things that lasted. He wanted to create something solid in a world that had felt unstable since childhood. That November night, he had stayed late because a delivery truck arrived behind schedule. By the time he locked up and began riding home, the rain had turned heavy and the temperature had dropped below 40 degrees. The old man he found on the roadside seemed out of place, dressed in a wool overcoat far too thin for the weather, leather shoes soaked through, a silver watch clinging to his wrist. As Caleb knelt beside him, he noticed the man's speech was slurred, his eyes unfocused. "He doesn't visit anymore," the old man murmured, barely audible over the rain. "Not since the papers." Caleb didn't understand what he meant, but the word stuck with him. When the ambulance finally arrived, called by Caleb using a cracked phone with limited minutes, paramedics loaded Thomas Whitmore onto a stretcher and asked Caleb for his name. Embarrassed by the attention and worried about getting home late, he simply said, "I'm nobody," and stepped back into the rain. What he didn't see was the black SUV idling half a mile away, its driver watching from a distance, making a phone call that would set events in motion before dawn. Thomas Whitmore was not an ordinary retiree wandering unfamiliar roads. Public property records, archived business filings, and regional business journals confirmed that decades earlier, he had owned substantial acreage on the outskirts of Harrisburg, land that later became central to a series of high-value development projects. His son, Andrew Whitmore, had transformed portions of that land into a thriving commercial real estate empire over the last 15 years, capitalizing on post-recession redevelopment opportunities that swept through many mid-sized American cities. Andrew was frequently featured in local newspapers and business magazines, praised for revitalizing downtown districts and donating to charitable foundations. He spoke often about family values, about honoring his roots. Yet neighbors near Thomas's modest assisted living apartment had noticed something troubling in recent months. The visits from his son had grown rare. Legal notices had been delivered. According to publicly accessible court summaries, a petition for guardianship had been filed just weeks before the night of the collapse, citing concerns about Thomas's cognitive health. Guardianship cases in the United States, as documented by investigative journalism pieces and government reports, can sometimes become contentious, particularly when substantial assets are involved. In this case, the filing raised quiet questions among those who knew the family's history. Thomas had reportedly resisted selling certain parcels of inherited land that had appreciated significantly due to nearby commercial expansion. After his hospitalization, while Caleb returned to his small house and slipped into bed without mentioning the incident, events accelerated behind closed doors. Andrew Whitmore was notified that his father had been admitted for hypothermia and possible cardiac distress. Security footage from the hospital entrance later confirmed his arrival within hours, dressed sharply, flanked by an attorney. Medical staff stabilized Thomas, noting confusion but also moments of clarity. During one such moment, according to a nurse's later account included in a civil deposition, Thomas asked about the boy in the jacket. He insisted that someone find him. Meanwhile, Andrew's representatives began inquiring about who had been present at the scene and whether any statements had been made. Private investigators, a common tool among high-net-worth individuals seeking to manage reputational risk, were quietly contracted. Caleb, unaware of any of this, focused on a math exam the following morning and on helping his sister prepare a presentation about American bridges, ironically citing examples like the Golden Gate and the Brooklyn Bridge, symbols of endurance and connection. 2 weeks later, a man in a tailored coat appeared outside Miller's Hardware asking for him by name. Caleb was escorted to the back office, heart pounding, as the visitor introduced himself as someone representing the Whitmore family. He thanked Caleb formally for assisting Mr. Whitmore and asked a single question that carried more weight than the words suggested. "Did he tell you anything about the papers?" Caleb shook his head, confused. He mentioned only the fragment about someone not visiting anymore. The man's expression tightened almost imperceptibly before he handed Caleb a business card and left. What Caleb still did not know was that days earlier, Thomas Whitmore had requested revisions to his estate plan. Estate planning disputes, particularly in families with significant real estate holdings, are well-documented sources of legal conflict across the United States, often resulting in drawn-out court battles and fractured relationships. In this case, preliminary drafts indicated a restructuring of asset distribution. Portions of land previously expected to transfer directly to Andrew were to be placed into a charitable trust focused on vocational training for underprivileged youth in central Pennsylvania. A modest educational grant was also proposed for the unnamed teenager who had assisted Thomas during the storm. When Andrew learned of these changes, according to later legal correspondence summarized in public filings, tensions escalated. He challenged his father's capacity to amend the will, citing the very guardianship petition he had initiated. Yet hospital evaluations noted intermittent clarity rather than permanent incapacity. The narrative that Thomas was entirely unable to make decisions grew harder to sustain. Media outlets began to catch wind of the dispute after a local reporter, researching property transfers, noticed unusual amendments tied to the Whitmore estate. Questions surfaced about elder autonomy, family loyalty, and the ethics of wealth management within powerful dynasties. Caleb, still attending school and working evenings, suddenly found himself contacted by journalists after his name appeared in a court document as the Good Samaritan. He declined interviews, uncomfortable with attention. All he had done, in his mind, was what his father would have expected. As winter deepened, Thomas Whitmore made a brief public appearance at a small community meeting, supported by a cane but speaking clearly enough to address the rumors. He did not attack his son. He did not air private grievances. Instead, he said quietly that sometimes a stranger reminds you of who you once hoped your own child would become. The room fell silent. Weeks later, the revised estate plan was finalized. The bulk of the contested land was transferred into a trust funding trade scholarships and apprenticeship programs for boys and young men from struggling families, echoing national conversations about the decline of vocational pathways in America. Caleb received a letter informing him that his future tuition, should he choose to pursue engineering, would be covered by the trust. It was not a fortune. It was not a mansion. It was opportunity. Andrew Whitmore retained substantial assets and faced no criminal charges, but public perception shifted. Commentators debated whether success had distanced him from the values he publicly championed. For Caleb, life did not transform overnight into luxury. He continued working, continued studying, and eventually enrolled in college with the quiet support of the scholarship bearing Thomas Whitmore's name. The night in the rain became a turning point spoken of in town with a mixture of pride and disbelief. And when asked years later why he stopped on that road, Caleb answered simply that a man was cold and needed help. In a nation where headlines often focus on division and ambition, the story stands as a reminder that legacy is measured less by net worth and more by the moments when someone chooses to stay in the rain with you. Why was Thomas Whitmore alone on that stretch of highway in rural Pennsylvania, miles away from the assisted living apartment where staff insisted he preferred his privacy? Why didn't his son, Andrew Whitmore, the polished real estate millionaire who frequently spoke about family loyalty in business interviews, step in long before his father collapsed in the rain? What exactly was hidden inside the estate revisions Thomas had reportedly signed just weeks before that November night? And how did a poor 17-year-old boy like Caleb Harper, who owned little more than a rusted bike and his late father's jacket, become central to a dispute involving millions of dollars in land and legacy? The official explanation circulated quietly at first, repeated by Andrew's legal representatives, and echoed in short statements to local media. Thomas Whitmore had chosen independence. He had insisted on managing his own affairs. He had declined increased supervision. It was framed as a dignified decision made by an aging man determined to maintain control of his life. But neighbors near Thomas's modest residence told a more complicated story, one that did not fit neatly into press releases or polished interviews. They recalled raised voices during rare visits from Andrew. They mentioned paperwork delivered by certified mail. One neighbor, who had lived across the hall for nearly 3 years, later stated in a recorded interview that Thomas often seemed anxious in the weeks leading up to the collapse, clutching a leather folder and muttering about documents he wouldn't sign. According to publicly accessible court summaries filed in Dauphin County around that time, Andrew Whitmore had initiated preliminary steps toward a guardianship petition, citing concerns about his father's cognitive decline. Guardianship proceedings, as documented in multiple investigative reports across the United States, can be both protective and controversial, particularly when substantial assets are involved. In this case, Thomas Whitmore was not simply a retiree with modest savings. Decades earlier, property records confirm he had acquired several parcels of land on the outskirts of Harrisburg when prices were low and development was sparse. Over time, as Pennsylvania's suburban expansion accelerated and commercial corridors widened, those once overlooked acres appreciated dramatically. Andrew Whitmore's rise as a real estate force in central Pennsylvania was closely tied to strategic development near land his father originally controlled. Business journals praised Andrew for vision and timing. Yet the deeper question lingered beneath the headlines. Who truly controlled the foundation of that wealth? When Thomas collapsed in the rain and Caleb Harper wrapped him in that army green jacket, he interrupted more than a medical emergency. He entered a fragile moment in an already strained relationship between father and son. Hospital intake records later referenced mild hypothermia and cardiac stress, but also noted periods of lucidity during which Thomas expressed fear about losing everything. A nurse's memo, included months later in a civil filing connected to the estate revision dispute, referenced Thomas asking repeatedly whether the papers had gone through. Which papers? That question would soon become central. Within days of the hospitalization, legal counsel representing Andrew Whitmore filed motions challenging Thomas's capacity to alter existing estate structures. The argument rested on alleged cognitive instability. However, medical evaluations conducted during Thomas's recovery indicated fluctuating but not absent competence. Such gray areas are common in elder law disputes, where determining capacity can hinge on detailed assessments and witness testimony. Meanwhile, revisions to Thomas Whitmore's estate plan were quietly finalized. Though exact figures were sealed, summaries referenced in court indexes indicated that a substantial portion of contested development land would be placed into a newly formed trust, aimed at supporting vocational training programs for underprivileged youth in central Pennsylvania. Even more surprising was a clause acknowledging the minor identified as Caleb Harper, granting him a funded educational pathway contingent upon academic enrollment. For Andrew Whitmore, whose public brand rested on disciplined leadership and calculated expansion, the shift represented more than a financial adjustment. It signaled a public narrative risk. Headlines began to surface in regional outlets questioning whether the philanthropist developer had attempted to consolidate control over family assets at the expense of his father's autonomy. Analysts pointed out that elder guardianship disputes have drawn national scrutiny in recent years, particularly when high-value estates are involved. The story gained traction not because of scandal alone, but because of contrast. On one side stood Andrew Whitmore, a millionaire accustomed to boardrooms and ribbon cuttings. On the other stood Caleb Harper, a teenager earning hourly wages, who had never met Thomas Whitmore before that storm. Caleb did not seek attention. He did not contact reporters. Yet his name appeared in filings as a beneficiary of a modest but meaningful educational provision. And the more journalists examined the timeline, the clearer it became that Thomas Whitmore's final revisions occurred after the night he spent in the rain, after the moment a poor boy chose to stop when others did not. The official story continued to insist that Thomas had chosen independence. But the alternative narrative, shared in hushed tones by neighbors and later echoed in courtroom exchanges, suggested something closer to abandonment. It suggested a father who felt pressured, a son determined to secure control, and a last-minute act of will shaped by gratitude toward a stranger. If true, that single act by Caleb Harper did more than keep an old man warm. It may have influenced the final direction of millions of dollars in land and altered the legacy of the Whitmore name. And if that was the case, then the question was no longer simply why Thomas Whitmore was alone in the rain. The question was whether the collapse on Route 17 exposed fractures that had been forming inside one of Pennsylvania's most respected families for years, fractures that one decision, made in cold silence under passing headlights, would bring into full public view. Caleb Harper was 17 years old the night he stopped his bike on that freezing November road, but responsibility had settled on his shoulders long before that storm ever rolled across rural Pennsylvania. He grew up in a small town where factories had thinned out and opportunity felt like something advertised somewhere else. When he was 10, his father died unexpectedly from a construction accident that left more questions than savings. From that day forward, Caleb watched his mother work double shifts at a nursing home an hour away, leaving before sunrise and returning long after dark, her hands rough and her eyes tired but determined. Public records show the Harper family lived in a two-bedroom rental on the edge of town, the kind of place where the refrigerator sometimes held more condiments than food and the sound of passing freight trains rattled the windows at night. Caleb never complained. Teachers later described him as quiet, present, focused. He didn't talk about hardship. He adjusted to it. By 15, he was working part-time at a local mechanic shop, sweeping floors at first, then learning how to change brake pads and rebuild carburetors. The owner, a Vietnam veteran named Mr. Lawson, once told a local reporter that Caleb showed up early, stayed late, and never asked for favors. In a town where some boys drifted, Caleb anchored himself to routine. School, work, home, homework at the kitchen table. He rode a rusted bicycle his father had once promised to replace, pedaling miles through winter air that stung his lungs. His dream was specific and steady. He wanted to become a civil engineer, to design bridges and roads, to build something permanent in a world that had taken stability from him too soon. Guidance counselors noted his aptitude for math and physics. He saved what he could from each paycheck, placing folded bills inside a metal box beneath his bed. But beyond grades and ambition, there was something older in him, something shaped by watching his mother carry more than she should and by stepping into the role of protector for his younger sister, Emily. He walked her to school when he could. He checked her homework. He shielded her from the harsher realities of unpaid bills and overdue notices. For men who understand the quiet weight of duty, Caleb's life would have felt familiar. He did what needed to be done without applause. He understood that manhood was less about words and more about action. And he had been raised with one rule, repeated by his father before he died and echoed by his mother when times were hardest. If a man needs help, you don't walk away. That rule was not philosophical to Caleb. It was practical. It guided small decisions, and on that November night, it guided a larger one. Meanwhile, miles away from the mechanic shop and the modest Harper home, Thomas Whitmore lived in a facility that brochures described as independent senior living on the outskirts of Harrisburg. The building was clean but unremarkable, with beige walls and trimmed hedges that concealed little about the loneliness within. Staff logs later referenced Thomas as polite, reserved, and frequently withdrawn. He kept to himself, declining most group activities. Visitors were rare. Sign-in sheets obtained during later estate proceedings showed Andrew Whitmore's name only a handful of times over the previous year, each visit brief. Thomas Whitmore had not always lived in quiet corridors. Decades earlier, property archives confirm, he purchased large tracts of undeveloped land beyond the city limits, farmland others dismissed as speculative. Over time, as commercial projects expanded and highways stretched outward, that land became valuable. Very valuable. Andrew Whitmore's ascent as a real estate mogul in Pennsylvania coincided with development projects strategically positioned near parcels originally tied to his father. Business profiles praised Andrew's aggressive expansion and financial discipline. Yet Thomas Whitmore himself lived simply, driving an aging sedan and carrying the same worn leather wallet he had owned for years. Inside that wallet, according to a nurse's note later referenced in court, he kept a faded photograph, a much younger Andrew standing beside him on a dirt field, both smiling under open sky. Thomas also carried documents folded carefully, occasionally checking to ensure they were still there. Staff recalled moments when he seemed anxious, asking whether mail had arrived, whether the changes were secure. In the weeks before the collapse, neighbors described him spending more time outside alone, even in colder weather. Which brings us back to that freezing November night in rural Pennsylvania, when Thomas Whitmore was found in the rain by Caleb Harper, a man who once controlled land worth millions, a father to Andrew Whitmore, one of the most powerful millionaires in the state, living modestly, rarely visited, clutching a leather wallet and a photograph of better days. So why was Thomas Whitmore alone in the rain, miles from warmth, when he had a son with resources beyond measure? The rain had been steady all evening, but by the time Caleb Harper reached the stretch of Route 17 where he would see Thomas Whitmore collapse, it had turned relentless, drumming against pavement and pooling in shallow dips along the roadside. Wind pushed sheets of water across the asphalt, blurring headlights into long streaks of white and red. Thomas Whitmore had been walking slowly, one hand gripping the old leather wallet inside his coat, as if steadying himself with memory alone. Witness statements collected later would suggest he had left the assisted living facility earlier than usual that night, declining an offer from staff to call a car. He told them he needed air. Whether he meant fresh air or distance from something heavier was never made clear. As he reached the guardrail near the bus stop shelter, he paused, pressed a trembling hand against his chest, and staggered forward. The impact when he hit the pavement was softened only by rainwater. Tires hissed past. A pickup truck swerved slightly, but did not stop. A sedan slowed, then accelerated again. Inside one of those passing vehicles, a driver later admitted to police that he had assumed someone else would help. That assumption followed Thomas Whitmore into the rain. Caleb Harper was approaching from the opposite direction on his bicycle when he noticed the figure on the ground. At first, he thought it was debris. Then he saw the movement, the faint attempt to push up from the asphalt. He braked hard, the rusted chain slipping as he jumped off and ran. Water soaked through his jeans instantly. He dropped to his knees beside Thomas Whitmore and leaned close enough to hear strained breathing over the storm. "Sir, can you hear me?" he shouted, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Thomas's eyes opened briefly, unfocused, searching. Caleb fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick and numb, and dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm but distant, explaining that weather conditions had slowed response times across the county. An ambulance was on the way, but it would take several minutes. Several minutes in near-freezing rain can feel like an hour. Caleb looked down at Thomas Whitmore, whose lips had begun to turn pale. Without hesitating, he shrugged off his army green jacket, the one that still carried faint traces of his father's cologne from years before, and wrapped it around the older man's shoulders. He helped him sit upright, supporting his back against the cold metal bench of the bus stop shelter just a few feet away. Together, they moved slowly, Caleb half carrying him beneath the thin overhang that offered little protection. Cars continued to pass, spraying water in wide arcs. Caleb shielded Thomas with his own body as best he could. Minutes stretched. Thomas Whitmore's breathing remained uneven. Then, just as Caleb leaned closer to check on him again, the old man's grip tightened around his sleeve. His eyes, clearer now, fixed on Caleb with sudden intensity. And that's when Thomas Whitmore said something strange. "He doesn't visit anymore, not since the papers." The words were barely audible, fragmented by exhaustion, but deliberate. Caleb blinked, unsure how to respond. "It's okay, sir," he said softly. "Help's coming." But Thomas Whitmore shook his head faintly, as if the reassurance missed the point. "Not since the papers," he repeated, his voice carrying a mixture of disappointment and something else. Fear, perhaps, or regret. Caleb did not know who he was. He did not know what papers Thomas Whitmore was referring to. All he knew was that the man in front of him seemed less worried about the rain and more troubled by something unresolved. In the distance, sirens finally pierced the storm. Red and blue lights reflected off wet pavement as the ambulance pulled up. Paramedics moved quickly, assessing Thomas Whitmore's condition and lifting him onto a stretcher. One of them turned to Caleb and asked for his name, his relationship to the patient. Caleb hesitated, suddenly aware of his soaked clothes and muddy hands. "I just found him," he said quietly. He stepped back as they loaded Thomas into the ambulance. In the confusion of flashing lights and radio chatter, no one pressed him for more information. By the time the doors closed and the vehicle sped off toward Harrisburg General Hospital, Caleb had already picked up his bicycle. He watched the ambulance disappear into the rain, then turned toward home, never imagining that his decision to remain anonymous would not remain that way for long. What Caleb Harper did not see that night was the security camera mounted above the hospital's emergency entrance, capturing every arrival and departure in grainy detail. When Thomas Whitmore was wheeled inside, soaked and disoriented, the footage also recorded a young man in worn jeans and a soaked t-shirt standing briefly under the awning before walking away. Hours later, that footage would be reviewed, not by hospital administrators, but by someone with a very different interest in who had been present. Across the parking lot, idling in the shadowed corner beyond the bright emergency lights, a black SUV remained stationary. Inside sat a well-dressed man in his early 40s, phone pressed to his ear, expression controlled. He had arrived minutes after being notified that Thomas Whitmore had been admitted. He did not step out immediately. He watched. When he finally ended the call, his gaze shifted toward the entrance just as Caleb disappeared from view. The man in the SUV was Andrew Whitmore, the millionaire whose developments shaped skylines across central Pennsylvania. And before dawn broke over Harrisburg, Andrew Whitmore had already been informed that his father was stable, that the hypothermia was treatable, and that there had been a witness, a teenage boy who had heard Thomas Whitmore mention something about papers. The millionaire had just been notified. By sunrise, Andrew Whitmore was no longer simply a concerned son waiting outside an emergency room. He was a man calculating exposure. Andrew Whitmore had built one of the fastest-growing real estate portfolios in central Pennsylvania, converting underused industrial corridors into retail centers, mixed-use developments, and luxury townhomes. Business journals regularly featured his expansion strategy. He sponsored local charity galas, donated to veterans foundations, and spoke at chambers of commerce about resilience and family values. His interviews often included references to his father, Thomas Whitmore, describing him as a hard-working landowner who taught him the importance of vision. Publicly, Andrew Whitmore represented discipline, growth, and generational success. But while cameras captured ribbon cuttings and philanthropic speeches, court records filed quietly in Dauphin County told a more complicated story. Weeks before Thomas Whitmore collapsed in the rain, Andrew Whitmore had initiated preliminary steps toward a legal guardianship petition, citing concerns about his father's decision-making capacity. Guardianship, when granted, can transfer significant authority over financial and medical choices. In families with substantial assets, it can also shift control of property and estate direction. Attached filings referenced ongoing property transfers involving parcels originally purchased by Thomas Whitmore decades earlier. Some of those parcels were adjacent to high-value developments tied to Andrew Whitmore's expanding commercial projects. Additional filings revealed disputes over specific tracts of land that Thomas Whitmore had reportedly refused to sell. The narrative Andrew's representatives provided emphasized protection, stability, and efficient management. Yet the timing raised questions. Just weeks before the collapse on Route 17, Thomas Whitmore had met privately with an estate attorney. According to publicly summarized revisions logged in probate documentation, he altered key provisions in his will. Portions of land previously assumed to remain under direct family control were redirected into a structured trust. The stated purpose: vocational scholarships and apprenticeship grants for underprivileged youth in central Pennsylvania. There was also a line referencing a minor identified as Caleb Harper, designating educational support should he pursue higher studies. The amendments were dated after tensions surrounding the guardianship petition began. Just weeks before the collapse, his father had changed his will. When Andrew Whitmore was informed of the revisions, internal correspondence later referenced in civil proceedings indicated concern about external influence. The question became unavoidable. Had Thomas Whitmore acted independently, or had the night in the rain altered his thinking? Andrew Whitmore did not initially address the matter publicly. Instead, he requested details. Specifically, he wanted to know about the boy. Within days, a private investigator was retained. Surveillance footage from Harrisburg General Hospital was reviewed. Staff were questioned discreetly. The image of Caleb Harper under the emergency awning was isolated, enhanced, circulated quietly. It did not take long to identify him. Small towns rarely keep secrets. Caleb Harper's name appeared in ambulance dispatch notes as the caller who reported an elderly male collapse along Route 17. From there, it was a matter of connecting school enrollment records and employment listings. One afternoon, as Caleb was finishing a shift at the mechanic shop, a man in a dark coat approached the garage office and asked to speak with him privately. Caleb assumed at first it was about unpaid fees or a misunderstanding. Instead, he was told that Andrew Whitmore wished to express gratitude for assisting his father. The wording was careful, measured. Caleb agreed to a brief meeting at a neutral office downtown, feeling both curious and uneasy. When he arrived, Andrew Whitmore was already seated at a polished conference table, posture straight, expression controlled. There was no camera, no press, no public acknowledgement. After a brief handshake, Andrew Whitmore asked a single question that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "What did he tell you?" Caleb hesitated, replaying the night in his mind. He mentioned only that Thomas Whitmore had said someone did not visit anymore, something about papers. Andrew Whitmore's eyes did not change, but the silence that followed lingered longer than necessary. He did not thank Caleb in any meaningful way. He did not ask about his life, his family, his future. The meeting ended quickly. Outside, Caleb felt a tension he could not explain. Over the following weeks, inquiries about Caleb Harper increased. Reporters began calling after probate records referencing the scholarship clause surfaced in public databases. Meanwhile, legal motions challenging Thomas Whitmore's capacity to amend his will were formally filed. Andrew Whitmore's team argued that the changes were made during a period of medical instability. Counterarguments pointed to hospital evaluations documenting intermittent clarity and direct testimony from Thomas Whitmore affirming his intentions. For Caleb, life continued with exams, shifts at the mechanic shop, and helping his sister with homework. Yet he became aware that something far larger than himself was unfolding. Neighbors whispered about land disputes. Online forums debated whether Andrew Whitmore's guardianship petition had been protective or strategic. The boy who had simply stopped in the rain now found himself indirectly connected to a legal and moral confrontation involving millions of dollars. The audience watching these events unfold could no longer ignore the central tension. Was Andrew Whitmore acting out of concern for his aging father? Or was the guardianship petition a pathway to secure contested land before Thomas Whitmore redirected it permanently? And why had Thomas Whitmore, in his moment of vulnerability under a bus stop shelter, chosen to mention papers to a stranger rather than to his own son? The investigation had shifted from medical emergency to motive, and the deeper it went, the harder it became to separate loyalty from leverage. As court filings accumulated and probate summaries became public record, a clearer picture of the conflict between Thomas Whitmore and Andrew Whitmore began to emerge. For months before the collapse on Route 17, developers had been circling a specific tract of land originally purchased by Thomas Whitmore in the late 1980s, acreage positioned strategically along a planned expansion corridor outside Harrisburg. Economic growth projections and infrastructure proposals had significantly increased its market value. Independent estimates referenced in regional business analysis suggested the land, if rezoned and developed commercially, could be worth tens of millions of dollars. Andrew Whitmore, whose real estate empire had grown through precisely this kind of long-term positioning, had reportedly presented structured offers to acquire or consolidate that parcel under his broader portfolio. Yet Thomas Whitmore declined. According to deposition excerpts later cited in estate litigation, Thomas stated he did not want the land sold for large-scale retail expansion. He described it as legacy property, something he had envisioned being used carefully or preserved through structured community benefit. The disagreement was not merely financial. It reflected opposing views about growth and control. Andrew Whitmore's guardianship petition, filed weeks before the storm, would have placed significant authority over Thomas Whitmore's financial decisions in Andrew's hands if granted. Control over medical care, yes, but also over property transfers and estate execution. In practical terms, it would have allowed Andrew Whitmore to manage, restructure, or potentially liquidate the disputed land without requiring his father's continued consent. That petition remained pending when Thomas Whitmore collapsed in the rain and was taken to Harrisburg General Hospital. During his recovery, medical staff documented fluctuating cognition, but also repeated affirmations of intent regarding his estate. Within days of stabilization, Thomas Whitmore requested another meeting with his estate attorney. The revisions that followed were more decisive than earlier drafts. Not only did Thomas reaffirm that the contested land would not be transferred directly into Andrew Whitmore's development holdings, but he formalized the creation of a vocational trust seated with a substantial portion of that property's projected value. The trust's mandate was clear: fund trade apprenticeships, engineering scholarships, and technical certifications for young men from economically strained backgrounds in central Pennsylvania. And within those same documents, in language later confirmed through probate indexing, Thomas Whitmore inserted a specific clause naming Caleb Harper. The description did not romanticize him. It identified him simply as the minor who provided aid during a medical emergency on Route 17. Thomas directed that Caleb Harper be granted full educational support should he pursue higher education in engineering or a related technical field. The amount allocated to Caleb Harper was modest relative to the overall estate, but symbolically significant. It represented gratitude translated into action. For Andrew Whitmore, the implications extended beyond money. If the guardianship petition succeeded, he could challenge these changes. But if Thomas Whitmore's competence at the time of revision was upheld, the structure would stand. When Andrew Whitmore was formally notified of the finalized amendments, internal correspondence later referenced in legal proceedings indicated immediate concern about potential reputational damage and strategic disadvantage. The land he had sought to consolidate would instead anchor a public trust associated with his father's name. And the teenager he had questioned in a private office would now be permanently connected to the Whitmore estate narrative. The shift altered the balance of control. The old man had refused to sell family land to developers. That land was worth tens of millions. His son wanted it. Guardianship would have given him control. But after the hospital stay, Thomas Whitmore changed the will again. And he left a portion not to Andrew Whitmore, but to Caleb Harper, the unknown boy who had stopped in the rain. When Andrew Whitmore learned the full extent of the revisions, the realization settled with unmistakable weight. The son found out. In the weeks that followed the amended estate filings, Thomas Whitmore experienced brief but documented periods of striking clarity. Medical evaluations entered into probate proceedings noted that while his memory fluctuated, there were sustained intervals during which he was fully oriented, aware of his assets, and able to articulate his intentions without confusion. One of those moments occurred during a private meeting attended only by Thomas Whitmore, Andrew Whitmore, and legal counsel. According to later testimony summarized in court transcripts, Andrew Whitmore pressed his father directly about the revisions, questioning whether outside influence had shaped the decision. Thomas Whitmore listened without interruption. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. Instead, after a measured pause, he looked at his son and said words that would echo far beyond that room. "This boy reminded me of who you used to be." The statement was not theatrical. It was quiet, almost reflective, but it landed with force. For a brief moment, the conflict over land, guardianship, and estate control receded behind something more personal. Thomas Whitmore clarified that the inheritance itself was never the central issue. The acreage outside Harrisburg had always represented possibility, not merely profit. By placing it into a structured trust, he intended to create a lasting pathway for young men like Caleb Harper, boys growing up in towns where factories closed, where fathers worked long hours, where opportunity required discipline and grit. The trust documents finalized after that meeting confirmed the allocation of significant projected value toward vocational scholarships, trade certifications, and engineering grants. Caleb Harper was named specifically, but not extravagantly. He was granted a modest education fund sufficient to cover tuition and materials should he pursue civil engineering, nothing more. No mansion, no luxury vehicle, no immediate wealth, just opportunity and dignity. Andrew Whitmore retained substantial holdings within his existing empire and faced no criminal charges related to the guardianship petition, which was ultimately withdrawn after Thomas Whitmore's competency at the time of revision was upheld. However, media coverage intensified. Regional outlets questioned whether the attempted guardianship had been protective or strategic. Commentators debated the ethical boundaries between family management and financial control. Andrew Whitmore's public image, once defined by unchallenged narratives of success and family values, absorbed visible strain. Invitations to speak at certain events quietly declined. Opinion pieces referenced the Route 17 incident as a symbolic contrast between inherited power and earned character. Caleb Harper, meanwhile, returned to school, to the mechanic shop, to the same modest house where his mother still worked double shifts. When asked by a reporter months later how he felt about the scholarship, he said only that he hoped to build bridges one day. Thomas Whitmore passed away the following year, his trust activated as written. The land that might have expanded a private empire instead funded apprenticeships across central Pennsylvania. And the image that endured was not of courtrooms or development maps, but of a rain-soaked highway where a 17-year-old boy chose to stop. Sometimes legacy isn't about wealth. It's about who shows up when it rains. Years from now, the details that will likely remain are not the court filings, not the contested acreage outside Harrisburg, and not the headlines that briefly questioned Andrew Whitmore's decisions. What endures is simpler and harder to dismiss. A freezing November night in rural Pennsylvania. A 17-year-old boy named Caleb Harper riding home on a rusted bicycle. An old man, Thomas Whitmore, lying alone in the rain. Caleb Harper never asked who Thomas Whitmore was. He did not ask about land values, estate structures, or development rights. He saw a man in distress and followed the rule he had been raised with. If a man needs help, you don't walk away. That decision altered the direction of millions of dollars and reshaped the legacy of the Whitmore name. But Caleb Harper did not know that at the time. He just didn't walk away. And that is where this story settles, not in boardrooms or probate courts, but back on that dark stretch of Route 17 where rain blurred headlights and time felt suspended. If you were standing there that night, watching cars pass and feeling the cold cut through your jacket, would you have stopped? Would you have stepped into the rain for a stranger with nothing to offer you in return? And if you were Andrew Whitmore, balancing ambition, image, and family responsibility, would you have handled it differently? Would you have chosen control or connection? Let me know in the comments what you think. And if you believe kindness still matters in today's world, subscribe for more real stories that challenge what we think we know.